Over this past weekend, we heard a story about protesters clashing in Los Angeles. TheHill.com reports protesters clash in LA over transgender woman disrobing in spa. You see, this story, this headline may be factually incorrect for a variety of reasons. First, I'll call out the framing. Protesters clashing? I mean, sure, that's technically the truth, the best kind of the truth, but in reality, it sounds more like some protesters were beaten by Antifa for saying they didn't want their daughters to see naked males. Now, this all stems from a video that went viral where a woman goes up to the counter at a spa saying that there was a man naked in the women's side. And apparently, the people who were working the counter said we can't discriminate on the basis of someone's gender identity. What I find fascinating about this is that the activists immediately assumed it was a trans woman. We do not know that. Well, I mean, maybe someone does somewhere, but I've looked up, I've dug into this a little bit, as much as I could. And the story just seems to be that a woman complained. We don't know about who or what happened, but that there was a biological male walking around naked in front of little girls, and she was upset about it. The left and the activists and Antifa immediately said, trans rights, transphobes gotta leave. We're now learning that aside from this clash and this incident, another woman came forward saying that a male with a beard and, private parts did the same thing at the spa when she was there. And therein lies the big ethical conundrum we have in this story. First, we have Antifa on the left willing to die on the hill of biological males should be allowed to walk around in the buff in front of little girls. I think you let them die on that hill. By all means, you embrace that. The culture war ends overnight. So I'll tell you this. There's probably a lot of people who don't believe the story. There's probably a lot of people saying that these are just transphobes. Okay. I'm going to show you the news. I'm going to show you what's being said. I'm going to show you some, to the best of my abilities, the videos of people being attacked, and share this video with your friends and family who don't believe it. This is what it's all about. Ask your friends and family, is this the hill that you will die on? It's a figure of speech, used a bit too much perhaps, but is this where you're willing to say we will draw the line? Because I got to tell you, man, I don't think there is. I'll put it this way. You go to any city in this country and ask any person, any father or mother or brother about their sisters being exposed to bearded males in the buff in their private, spas. And they're going to be like, no way. In fact, I think that the reaction would be particularly distinct and emotive from the average person when you say, should there be naked males around little girls? They're going to be like, are you nuts? But for some reason, the left is actually engaging pretty heavily over this to the point where some prominent feminists refuse to condemn what they don't even know about. Check it out. Let me read you this story, okay? I'm going to read you this story. And the important point is, we don't know if this was a trans woman. The Hill reports, tensions rose Saturday between protesters and counter-protesters in LA over a spa incident involving a transgender woman. Last week, a cisgender woman complained to staff at We Spa in Koreatown after a transgender woman disrobed in a designated women's section of the spa. Quote, it's okay for a man to go into the women's section, show his junk around other, she says a different word, around the other women, young little girls, underage. Your spa, We Spa, condones that? A female patron asked the staff in a video that went viral on Twitter. He is not female. A staff member responded that the facility could not discriminate against the woman based on her gender identity, sparking further outrage among some customers. Another female patron was shown in the video demanding her money back and vowing not to return to the spa. Demonstrators flocked to We Spa, some to protest against the spa and others to defend the transgender women's rights. Listen, okay, here's how it works. I've warned about this over the past several years, that these anti-discrimination laws, they mean it. And there's something fascinating that conservatives need to recognize, and that's social enforcement. We'll get into that in a second. You cannot discriminate on the basis of biological sex. That is in the 1964 Civil Rights Act. I'm pretty sure it says you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. That means you cannot have gender segregated bathrooms. Now, ultimately, the issue is social enforcement. When this law was passed, nobody believed it would be the end of gender segregation, that men and women had different bathrooms for obvious reasons. But think about it for 2 seconds. This was the end of racial segregation. There were distinct bathrooms for people who were white and people who were not white. They said, we're going to pass this law that bans discrimination. That includes between, you can't discriminate on the basis of gender, I think national origin, sex, religion, etc. Okay. So that instantly ended the segregated bathrooms, the segregated restaurants and things like that, right? How is it that we retained gender segregation when the law says biological sex? It was because socially, no one, not anybody in the black community or the white community or the activist community were like, yeah, we should totally put men and women in the same space. But the law is the law. You see what happens. Now it's coming to roost some 5 or so decades later because the law is clear. A biological male, regardless of identity, could walk in and say, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, perhaps there would be some lawsuits involved. Perhaps there is some precedent I'm not aware about. But as far as I can tell, based on the language of the law, it doesn't matter if the person's trans or not. They say gender identity. You can't discriminate on the basis of gender identity. And I'm like, that's totally irrelevant to the conversation. If you provide a public accommodation, then you provide it to everybody. This is where things get really, really interesting in this debate. The argument from the courts has been that if a university has a women's only program that discriminates against men violating the Civil Rights Act, I think that one's Title VII, or that one might be Title IX because it's universities. It's fine so long as they offer up an equal program for the men. Think about that logic for 2 seconds. Separate, but equal. It doesn't work, does it? Back in the day, that was the argument about racial segregation, and we said that was wrong. I mean, I personally think racial segregation is wrong. However, I think there are very distinct differences between men and women, that women probably want safe spaces or biological females want safe spaces, but you see where this legal argument brings us. If you cannot have 2 distinct spaces for different races, then the argument that so the argument is basically, as long as everyone gets access to a bathroom, it's fair. Well, they said, no, that's not true. Everyone should be able to use the same facilities. Now we're having that argument over biological sex. It is the exact same argument and following the exact same law. But there are differences here. The issue is, in my opinion, anti-discrimination laws need to be specific based on the characteristics by which we are weighing the law. So when it comes to race, I don't think race is an important factor at all in determining whether or not people should be allowed to use certain bathrooms. I think ending racial segregation is a good thing. In fact, I like the fact that we're trying to get, people to understand each other's cultures and then make this great American melting pot. Sounds fantastic. But when it comes to female versus male, there's something interesting, which brings into a whole nother argument in the racial component about women on average are shorter than men. Women on average are less aggressive, more agreeable. They tend to have less muscle mass. They have different shaped bodies. And so because of these things, we've said, okay, well, that we're not going to get rid of, right? Well, here you go. Your anti-discrimination laws are here. Now, there's that argument, right? Like I mentioned, colleges say you can't discriminate on the basis of sex unless you offer free equal spaces. So these spas have a men's room and a women's room. And what they're basically saying is you can't go in the women's room, but we have a men's locker room just for you. You see where the argument hits that wall. Now it's all going to come down to this and whether or not the left is willing to stand by this. Whether or not the left will say that a biological male should be allowed to walk around naked around biological females. I think there's a fair point on the left that the moral outrage over this is similar in many ways to the moral outrage over ending racial segregation. And they like to say that, commentators like Tim Pool would have been pro-segregation, blah, blah. It's ridiculous and absurd and not true because I come from a mixed family. But I digress. I ultimately believe I should say this. I believe there is a strong possibility that the right loses this one. Absolutely. However, I say strong possibility, not the strong probability. I think a strong possibility could be a couple percentage points. Ultimately, I think there is the overwhelming majority of people would never stand for this because men are protective of their sisters, their mothers, their daughters, and their sisters, mothers, and daughters also agree and don't want biological males around them in this capacity. They're going to say exchanges broke out between the two groups. Sure. With some escalating to punches. In one video, a woman is standing by herself, seemingly confused. She's like, just looking exasperated. I don't understand why this is a problem. We don't want, males in the female space. And they're screaming at her, transphobe, go home. If this is what the left wants, by all means. But I tell you this, man, if people on the right, or not even on the right, because there are people who aren't left or right, who are going to look at this and be like, yo, these people are crazy. Yeah, well, if you don't stand up and say, we don't want this, you'll get it. Because the law is already clear. They're protesting the spa. The spa can't do anything. It's the law. I remember I warned about this back in 2018. I made a bunch of videos about this. I said, these laws in New York, for instance, say that gender identity is defined as self-expression, and you can't discriminate based on how someone dresses or the name they use or how they express themselves. And I'm like, that is insanely broad. Insanely broad. So put it this way. A guy could walk into Starbucks, apply for a job, and show up the next day in a full fursuit and say his real name is Vociferon, Herald of the Winter Mists, and you are legally obligated to use his name, allow him to dress that way. Now, as I mentioned before, I talked to a lawyer about this. I've called human rights lawyers investigating this story, and I said, what would happen if someone said their gender identity was Mystical Fox and their name was Vociferon, Herald of the Winter Mists, and they applied for a job and got it, but then were later told they couldn't dress that way? The lawyer said it wouldn't pass the laugh test. Okay. The laugh test, as he describes it, is you sue, you go into court, and the judge looks at you and says, you're trying to do what? And you get laughed out of the courtroom. And I said, okay. It wouldn't pass the laugh test. This is interesting in my opinion. Interesting. So I asked I asked these lawyers this. They said we have judges for a reason. They can interpret the law and try to see if it makes sense and is being applied fairly and rationally. And someone trying to exploit the system with some ridiculous outfit would never get past it. I said, what if that's their actual gender identity? Like the law doesn't define gender identity as either male or female. It says your self-expression. So how would the court have the authority to laugh at someone based on what they personally think is absurd? He's like, well, that's what judges do. Then I suppose they'll vote for other judges. And I said, okay, so let's think about this for 2 seconds. You get a conservative judge in New York. A trans woman shows up with a beard, very broad shoulders, wearing a dress, and says, I am a strong woman and I should not be discriminated against based on being a woman. Does the judge have the right to laugh that person out of court when the law was designed to protect them? And it was a more than one lawyer who said, well, in that instance, it's different. It's different. It's different? If the judge finds something to be absurd, what gives the judge the right to decide what is or isn't absurd? Well, that's what judges do. They judge. I said, okay. So it stands to reason that the real issue is social enforcement, not the law. The law isn't relevant here. It is a little bit, but think about it. Someone could have made the argument that you can't discriminate on the basis of sex and they have a right to use these bathrooms. Oh, but they say, but we provide equal access to men in the same public accommodation. And then you say, yeah, and you provided same access to black people that you provided to white people, but that was deemed unconstitutional. What's the difference here if the law says X in both regards? Like, how do you say that Civil Rights Act protects against this discrimination, and so we're not going to allow segregation? It also protects against this discrimination, but we're not going to end segregation in terms of biological sex. Ultimately, the cows come home, right? And here we are. And it seems reasonable that the end result of this will either be a revolt among regular people who don't want to stand for this, or people unwilling to stand up because Antifa will beat them. And, well, there you go. Count Dankula says, Antifa really be out there attacking people for saying that it's not okay to show your genitals to children. It's a funny tweet. I retweeted it. It's like, that's crazy, Antifa. That's crazy. But let's think about that for 2 seconds. See where we're at. There are male locker rooms where males walk around in the buff and children and underage people are in there and can see naked dudes. There's a joke people mention about the old guy walking around with his balls hanging out, and there could be underage kids in there, but they're guys. Okay. Antifa says it shouldn't matter what the kids are seeing. And it seems like the other side is saying they should only be seeing their own genitals, I suppose. I don't know how this plays out. I do think that this is very different from the racial component, because you can make the argument about we shouldn't discriminate on the basis of race, because race is not the end all be all of biological determinism or whatever. The point being that people of all different races can share values, are either male or female, and so the racial component was dumb. Segregating based on race was stupid. For biological females, though, they do tend to be smaller. They do tend to have less muscle mass, and that's a serious component to this. The concern is that men are more likely to are the overwhelming majority of sex crimes against, and it's mostly against women. Now, most violent crimes are male on male, but when it comes to assaults and harassment, it's male on female, and that's probably one of the reasons we separate these spaces. Feminists don't care for that argument anymore. They quite literally do not, and I'll show you. We have this tweet from Lori Penny, prominent feminist, and it's actually a long thread, between her and some other feminists who are arguing over trans issues. And you have gender critical feminists who say that trans women should not be granted the same spaces as biological females because there are clashes. In one tweet, Lori Penny said, "Today I learned that the modern anti-trans movement is convinced that males rape females because of their biology. This is the same boys will be boys logic that has been used to excuse violence for centuries. Biology is destiny is the logic of rape culture." Now that is fascinating. My response was, why have so many male feminists turned out to be abusers? What about the feminist space either attracts them or encourages the behavior? If Lori Penny does believe that biology doesn't play a role in this at all, then what about the feminist space is attracting the abusers or encouraging abusive behavior? Because it's certainly not their biology, right? Something the feminists do is making the male feminists abusers, and it's not biology. Therefore, it's a social construct of some sort. They're attracting it. No idea. Well, there's a simple reason. There's a simple explanation. Males are different from females. Males have different hormones than females. Males have different biological driving factors. I guess you can call that biological determinism, but it's just true. It's not absolute. Some males tend to be weaker than some females. Gender, as they say, is bimodal, meaning there's a great overlap somewhere in the middle. But the overwhelming majority of individuals will have, like males, prenatal testosterone, more fast twitch muscles, narrower hips, broader shoulders, more muscle mass, twice as much collagen in the skin. These things are reality. You can pretend it's not true, but it is true. Objective reality exists. In which case, Lori Penny believes that males aren't attacking females because of their biology. She genuinely believes that men are taught to do this, I guess. No, I think there's a reason why when you look at animals, the males behave differently from the females without social constructs. I think there's a reason why you can look to the lobster and their hierarchy going back thousands of or millions of years. The noble lobster has hierarchy, right? The point is, biology is real. It's not absolute, but it is real. In which case, there are people who want to have safe spaces for biological females. In the UK, there's a story I covered a few years ago. They started introducing unisex locker rooms. They found that assaults on women went up something like 80 or so percent. What was the argument from these feminists as to why that was happening? Why was it constantly that men were attacking females? Why did that number go up when this changed? It's simple. Access. That's it. I think these were unisex changing rooms. I could be wrong. It's been a long time since I covered the story. But the general idea is there are many males who are abusers. There are many females who are also abusers, but there tend to be more abusive males. Violent crime tends to be committed by biological males. That's a fact. Yes, biological females can commit violent crimes and do, and in great numbers, but it's overwhelmingly biological males who do it. So what happens is you have males who are abusers, and then they're then given opportunity. When you segregated the men's room from the women's room and the males from the females, the abusive males did not have opportunity or access. Now that they've combined the spaces because of many of these laws, this is what happens. Now, the real ramifications of this in places like New York, the gender identity discrimination bills and things like that, were not big open bathrooms that everyone uses. It was individual stalls. I actually think that's a good idea and a great development. I mean, think about it. It used to be that you'd go in the men's room, and still is in many places, and you've got 2 stalls and a urinal and a sink. And you walk in with a bunch of other people, and you can hear them farting, and you're like, oh, man, it's uncomfortable because I'm trying to take a whiz, and, it's like, oh, geez. Now what do you get? You walk in, you get a private room. You lock the door behind you, and you sit back and say, privacy. It's beautiful. I know most people don't care, but whatever. I think it's made it it's improved the experience of the public restroom, sure. Although there are problems with that as well, because if you look at Starbucks, their restrooms were trashed with needles and stuff like that because people now had a private space to do illicit things. But the idea was that in many places, you just have men and women using any bathroom. Now, that's happened in some places where they're building new buildings and doing just big unisex showers and bathrooms. But in many places, it's just anybody can do whatever they want. So now we have this issue. There are many people who are saying trans women would not exploit the law to go in and abuse girls or whatever. I don't think people are concerned about trans women doing that. Like legitimate trans people. I mean, look, Blair White is fantastic. Runs a great channel, has lots of fans, principled. I really don't think Blair White is a threat to anybody. That's just, Blair's great. But there are some predators who are male who will lie. You see how that works? Now, of course, the left says they're not going to undergo treatment in order to lie. It's like, okay, they don't have to. That's the issue in this story. Transgender woman with a beard and male parts got in a hot tub with her daughter, 6, at LA Spa more than a year before the weekend clashes over child exposure incident in female steam room. I think, I'm sure back during the civil rights era, there were many conservative types, Democrats mostly, who were outraged at the thought of ending racial segregation, saying they shouldn't have to share these spaces or whatever. And now there are many people who are outraged over this. I don't know how history will reflect on everybody, but I certainly feel the need to keep, children safe. What do? Well, you can protest, I suppose. You can speak up. You can share videos like this and ask people if they're really okay with that. And as we saw in the video, it seems like the answer is they are. As the woman was complaining that there was a man with male parts, a man walks up to her and says, but was it a trans woman? But are you? And then she said, no, it wasn't. This is the issue. If somebody is black and they went into the wrong segregated space, people would say outright, this person's not supposed to be there. There was no question over whether or not the person was actually white, but looked the wrong, race. So there's a difference here. Granted, I know racial segregation was stupid and horrible. In this instance, this could literally just be a predator walking in the women's room and exposing himself. And the immediate response from the left and the patrons is, but it could be a trans woman. Okay. If that's the case, and you err on the side of, well, maybe it's a trans woman, so we don't intervene, then yes, the conservatives are right when they say that you are giving a pass to abusers and creepos. I don't know what you do about it. Stand up, speak out, say no, and reject this and protest and let the left die on this hill. But I'll tell you this, you might be shocked by this. But if you don't stand up and speak out, the left will keep getting their way. I mean, listen, it's already the law. You've lost that part of this. So to the people who say, I can't speak up, I'm scared of losing my job. Okay, I love it when you're like, I have kids. I can't speak up. I'll lose my job. I get it. 100%. I don't have kids. I don't know what that must feel like. You must be scared. Okay. Let me know how you feel when your daughter is, in her school locker room and, 40-year-old male walks in, and let me know how you feel about that future for your child. Because if you're unwilling to speak up and say you don't like that, that's the future your child will get. That's just the truth. I'm not saying this to disparage you or drag you for being scared. Just understand the reality of what you will leave for your children if you're afraid to stand up and speak up for what you believe in. That goes for everybody, even on the left. I'll leave it there. Next segment's coming up at 1 p.m. on this channel. Thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all then.